All right, guys, I'm going to do a fun bonus video here on something called timelines. Timelines were very recently added to Construct, and they're very cool. It's basically a way to custom just make something move around the screen in a certain way. You can also alter the size and angle of the object. There's some different applications you'll have. So what I'm going to do for this game is I'm going to take my Silly Salmon logo, and I'm going to make the logo like dance around the screen instead of just sitting there. So to start a timeline, so think of a timeline as just like a custom animation where the physical object is just moving a certain way, right? Um, so the first thing we need to do is I need to get the timeline window open at the bottom. There are two ways to do it. I could either do menu, view bars, and then the timeline bar is here. I could do it that way. Or I could go in my window over here and I could open it from this window over here. So what I would need to do is I need to make a timeline. So I'm going to right click on this timelines button here and I'm going to do add timeline. And now that I have my timeline created, I can double click it. And that will also open the timeline window. So either just double click on your created timeline or go to menu bars and view timeline. So now that I have my timeline, I need to anchor it down on the bottom. So on the bottom, you'll see like a blue square down there and you just hover over that. And I can hover in between here and I can change the size. I'll let my timeline be a little bit bigger though so that we can see it. Okay, so right now it's just an empty timeline. Okay, so now what we're going to do is I need to drag the sprite that I want to move around onto the timeline. So this Silly Salmon text, I'm going to have this dance around. So I'm going to drag that onto the timeline. And now what it does is it creates several things onto here. So I'm just going to explain what this is. So these black lines here, and if you've taken like video productions, you know some of these terms already. But these black horizontal lines, this is like the track. So basically, time is going to flow on this track. And you can see here there's a timeline ruler at the top, and it says 1S, 2S, 3S. That's how many seconds my timeline is going. And this red bar is where we currently are on the timeline. So if I click on this ruler, that red bar will change. That'll show me where I am on that animation. Okay. Um, it's kind of hard to see. You'll see them more later as I make them, but there'll be these little black circles. Those are called master keyframes. So basically what it is we can place keyframes throughout our timeline. I can make the object do different things on each keyframe, and then the computer will just basically do what it needs to do to get it from point A to point B and kind of fill in the animations in between. So it'll just make it move naturally, or it'll grow or shrink if you change the size, whatever it wants to do, based on what your keyframes say. Okay. There's also property tracks below that. So this top one is like your main track where like your object is. So where here it says title 20. This is my, and there's a little picture of the Silly Salmon logo. So this is the main track that determines what my sprite's doing. The X and Y are properties for that sprite. So these are going to be the X and Y coordinates of the sprite. So as my timeline goes, if I move this around, the X and Y will change on my timeline. You could have other properties. It could be the angle, it could be the size, all different kinds of things. So we'll kind of go through all that stuff. Okay. There's also a green line right here. It's kind of hard to see. It's on the 5-second mark. That determines the end of the timeline. So this is however long you want the entire animation to last. So if I only want the last 4 seconds, I could take this and I could drag it down to 4 if I just want it on 4. Okay. The other way you can change it is your timeline has a property window. So if you click on your timeline title down here, you'll get your properties up here, which is, oh, sorry, you have to click it up here, my bad. Click the timeline title right here, okay? And then the properties will change up here on top. And so now here, the total time, that's the green line. So if I change this total time to like 6, you'll see that the green line over here moved to 6, okay? But you could just drag it down here as well, whatever you want to do, whatever makes more sense to you that you want to do, okay? And then if I click back and get my properties here, the time, that's the red line. So the time just represents the current time that we're looking at in the timeline. So this red line is basically where you want to edit or what part of your timeline you're editing, okay? So what we're going to do to start animating this is we're going to enter edit mode. It's very important you come down here where my red circle is and you click on that pencil. When you click on the pencil, notice it highlights the object in yellow. So now it knows that I'm editing this object, okay? So the first thing you have to, there's three things you have to do when you start. You have to set the current time, so you have to put where the red line is going to be. You have to set any properties of your object that you want at that point, and then you have to make it a keyframe. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the 1 second mark. So I'm going to click and put my red line on the 1 second mark, okay? Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the properties. So here's my object. What I can do is if I want it to move, I can literally drag and move it. And if you're doing this right, it should be highlighted in yellow. That's telling you you're not actually editing the object, you're just editing the timeline. And you can see I can change the position here. And you can see over here, all my properties now are in yellow. They're telling me I'm not changing the properties of the actual object, I'm just changing the location of it, okay? So now that I've moved it here at the 1 second mark, I want it to move down to this location. So then what you have to do is you have to make it a keyframe. So what I have to do is I have to right click on my object, this title 20 here, and I have to do set keyframes. Now what happened is right here on the 1 second mark, notice it added a black dot. That means that's a keyframe, okay? And then the blue squares, those are property keyframes. So that's showing the X and Y values. So if I click on this blue square here, it's telling me that my X value is 135 at that spot. So if I wanted to edit that, I could edit it from the properties there and change it. Okay, but I'll show you how to change something you've already started in a second here. So now we're just going to keep going on with this process, okay? So I'm going to click on my title 20 here, my object, to highlight it in yellow again. And I just repeat that process. So I'm going to set current time. So I'm going to click on 2 seconds to move my red line there. Okay, I'm going to set the properties. So that means I want to move it. Okay, and then I just do add keyframe. So I right click here, add keyframe, or set keyframes, my bad. Repeat it again, go to the 3 second mark, move it again, set it as a keyframe. And then I'm gonna go to the 4 second mark, and I'm gonna move it back to the top. So I'm just doing like a diamond motion. It's just gonna move around in a diamond. Okay, got it moved, and I'm gonna set keyframe. Okay, now down here at the bottom, it's got a little preview button. It's this button right here. And when you press it, you'll see that it just moves around and does what it needs to do. Okay, now there's a couple of things that I want to change. It only took me 4 seconds to do the whole thing. So I'm going to click on my timeline 1 down here. And in the properties for total time, I'm going to change it to 4. And that green line basically moved to the 4 second mark. Okay, and then I'm going to tell it to loop. So if I tell it to loop, I can preview again, and you'll see it will just infinitely loop around, and my text is going to keep moving and looping around, okay? Now there's another option we can do called ping pong. Ping pong means when it gets to the end, it'll just reverse. So what ping pong means, it'll get the end, and then it'll backtrack the other way, and then it just bounces back that way. So if you want to do ping pong or loop, that's up to you. So I'm going to do loop, okay? So now I've got all of that set, okay? Now let's say you wanted to go in and edit and change something at a certain spot, okay? So one way I could do it is I could go down here and I could click each individual property marker, which are the blue squares, and change it that way. To me, what I think is easier is I'm going to click on my title 20 to make it yellow, okay? And then if you're hovering, see how mine looks like a little finger here? I'm on the ruler on the top. If you hold control while dragging, you can actually move to a certain point in time. So it'll actually animate. So I'm going to let go, and I'm going to say right here at this point, I want mine to maybe get bigger, and maybe I want it to spin around or something. So if I click on it here and I go to the properties, let's say I want to make it bigger. I'm going to make it 570 by 150. Okay, you'll see it'll get bigger. Okay, and then I could change the angle. Let's do 45 degrees. Okay, so I'm just going to have it do something crazy. Now, when you edit it, and this can be very easy to forget, you have to reset the keyframe. So if I right click down here, I have to do set keyframes to actually have that change happen. Okay, so now I'm going to go back down here, and I'm going to hold control and drag it to the next spot. So right here. Now maybe I want the size to go back down to normal. I am at the end of my recording limit, so I'm going to stop here and I'll continue this in the next video.